here. So it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Elliot Cohen. Dr. Cohen is the principal founder of Philosophical Counseling in the United States, executive director and co-founder of the National Philosophical Counseling Association, and president of the Logic-Based Therapy and Consultation Institute. Dr. Cohen is the author of dozens of articles and books. His most recent publication is Are You Making Love or Just Having Sex? A Philosophical Guide to Enduring Love and Sexual Intimacy, published by Anthem Press on October 15, 2024. It also should be noted that Dr. Cohen has completed his Master's of Social Work from Florida State University. What an accomplishment. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Cohen.
Thanks so much, Sam. I had kind of an introduction already to, what I'm going to talk about. So I don't know if it was deliberate that you put Sean there or it was just a good accident, but he was well situated for my discourse. And this paper discusses the nature of self-talk, characterizing it as a psycholinguistic activity consisting of the performance of speech acts directed to oneself. And more specifically, it examines negative speech acts as embedded in behavioral and emotional reasoning, the performance of which creates behavioral and emotional disturbances for the agent, such as anxiety, depression, guilt, and anger. This characterization has important implications for psychotherapy, namely that helping clients to identify these speech acts and replacing them with ones that have antidotal properties can be therapeutic. So the name of this paper, part of it was in the program, the psycholinguistics of self-talk and logic-based therapy. But the second part of it is using a toolbox of philosophical antidotes to overcome self-destructive speech acts. So I'm going to speak about something that I think is pretty interesting. According to logic-based therapy, LBT, a popular form of philosophical counseling that I created, cardinal or key self-destructive speech acts can be counteracted by uplifting philosophical speech acts when the latter resonate with clients. This means that philosophical psychotherapies such as LBT can potentially have significant therapeutic value. Based on this premise, this paper introduces and discusses an AI-generated toolbox of philosophical antidotes created by the Institute of Logic-Based Therapy and Consultation in the United States to help clients find suitable resonant philosophical antidotes to their self-destructive speech acts. Okay. Speaking is doing, and this part is called self-talk as linguistic performance. Speaking is doing. This is one of the most significant insights to have come out of 20th century philosophy of language. In J.L. Austin's landmark book on how to do things with words, a series of lectures delivered at Harvard University in 1955, Austin wrote, "The phenomenon to be discussed is very widespread and obvious, and it cannot fail to have been already noticed, at least here and there, by others. Yet, I have not found attention paid to it specifically." And that's how he essentially starts off that little book, How to Do Things with Words, that many of us, if not all, are familiar with. What Austin had in mind was the false assumption that ordinary language is primarily about describing facts out in the world, whereas such describing is only one of many types of speech acts that we can perform. The case of speaking to oneself is a good example of what Austin was talking about, because much of what we do when we speak to ourselves goes beyond describing facts and largely goes unnoticed by us. Thus, In taking a stroll by yourself, feeling a few drops of water on your cheek, your internal voice exclaims, "It's starting to rain and I don't have an umbrella." In saying this to yourself, you are not merely informing yourself of a fact. Instead, you are inferring, I guess, enthematically, from the drops of water you feel on your cheek that there will be torrents of other drops soon to follow. You are predicting that you will be drenched without an umbrella to protect you. You are expressing dismay over the content of these inferences and predictions. You are also probably catastrophizing about it, overrating how bad it is for your dry body and freshly laundered clothing to be soaked by the anticipated rain. And I think, this is an experience that we've all had. You don't have an umbrella and there it starts to rain, and what's going on here? Lots of activity here. In catastrophizing, you are sounding an alarm to get prepared psychophysically for the predicted rain, where the magnitude of this alarm is determined by the measure of your negative rating. The anxiety you subsequently feel is thus the perlocutionary effect of your alarmist speech act. That is what you do through catastrophizing as distinct from in catastrophizing. Indeed, it's easy to talk to yourself without realizing what you are doing when you do so. Essentially, talk therapy is about helping clients to identify their self-talk and to reframe it when it creates, sustains, or exacerbates emotional and/or behavioral problems. Some forms of talk therapy are non-directive and person-centered, stressing the therapist-client alliance as the primary vehicle of change. Other approaches, such as a cognitive behavior approach, utilizes various techniques, for example, imagery, role-playing, bibliotherapy, and homework assignments. Many practitioners are eclectic and utilize a combination of both. The view I have developed and regularly apply in my clinical practice belong to the latter class of approaches. It's called logic-based therapy, as previously referenced. This approach is based on rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, which is the first form of cognitive behavior therapy, CBT. It is distinguished from the latter by its use of various forms of logic, including inductive, deductive, and modal varieties, virtue theory, and many different philosophical perspectives that it uses as antidotes to self-destructive speech acts. And the next section is logic-based therapy's cardinal and emotional and behavioral fallacies. LBT distinguishes between two interconnected types of practical reasoning, emotional and behavioral. It is within the premises and/or conclusions of these two types of reasoning that self-destructive speech acts specific to the type of reasoning in question may be performed. Emotional reasoning modulates emotions such as depression, anxiety, anger, and guilt. For example, if I can't get a job in academia after I spend 4 years getting my doctoral degree, then I must be a total failure. It's possible that I won't be able to get such a job after getting my doctorate. So it's possible that I'll be a total failure. In this modal variant of emotional reasoning, the client makes himself anxious by performing the non-assertive evaluative speech act of entertaining or speculating about the possibility of being a total failure. Within this act of entertaining or speculating, the client may also be implicitly performing the act of self-damning. That is, while entertaining the possibility of not getting a job, the client damns himself and feels like a total failure. In the latter case, the client would experience anxiety about not getting a job in academia. If this were merely entertaining or speculating about the latter, without the act of self-damnation or related evaluative fallacies, the client would not be experiencing anxiety. According to Aristotle, the conclusion of practical syllogisms, as distinct from theoretical ones, is an action. He states that in the theoretical type, oneself affirms the conclusion, but in the case concerned with production, it must immediately act. For example, if everything is sweet, ought to be tasted, and this is sweet, the man who can act and is not prevented must at the same time actually act accordingly. LBT agrees with Aristotle that the conclusion of a practical syllogism is an action. But here's the kicker. However, whereas he was thinking in terms of overt behavioral responses, such as tasting a sweet thing, LBT takes the acts in question to be speech acts, particularly ones that rate or judge someone or something, that is, evaluate an emotional object in one way or another. For example, this is the case when the client is entertaining or speculating about the possibility of being a total failure. And within this context of performing this speech act, damns himself. Now, if the minor premise shifts from possibility to actuality, as when the speaker graduates with a doctorate and has not been able to get such a job, then they may succeed in depressing themselves. This is what I have meant by saying that anxiety is depression waiting to happen. And there's an article in Psychology Today that I wrote. You can access it online. By that title that talks about that. Whereas both depression and anxiety may involve acts of self-damning, anxiety also always includes an act of entertaining or speculating. It is future-oriented. The two emotions are thus logically related because on the modal status of the minor, depending on the modal status of the minor reportive premise, if it has an unactualized if clause, it's only a possibility, then the emotion's anxiety. However, when the latter if clause is actualized, the emotion turns into depression. And I think it's somewhat funny, actually, in a sad way, to think about the psychological research that's done to determine that there's a connection, between a depression and anxiety. Of course, there is, because they're logically related by virtue of the structure of their emotional reasoning. It's not you don't have to empirically research it. If you understand the logic of it, you can actually understand it. It's kind of like saying all frisky frogs are frisky. Let me go prove it. And then you go out and you start examining frogs and noticing they're frisky and then drawing the generalization. You don't have to do it, and it's the logical structure. In contrast to emotional reasoning, behavioral reasoning modulates behavioral changes, as in the following reasoning. If I will be rejected by my inner circle if I don't do as they do, then I should do as they do. I will be rejected by my inner circle if I don't do drugs as they do. So I should take drugs as my inner circle does. In this reasoning, the client jumps on the bandwagon in the conclusion by telling himself he should do as his inner circle does and take drugs. And using the term should, he prescribes such behavior to himself. So as Aristotle would suggest, he will, ceteris paribus, take the drug when the opportunity arises. And if the opportunity doesn't arise and he's blocked from doing it, then he won't. Okay, so it's not a necessary conclusion that he's going to act. Practical reasoning, as in the above examples, typically has an empirical or quasi-empirical minor premise that performs a reportative speech act, such as making a factual claim or prediction. For example, I will be rejected by my inner circle if I don't do drugs as they do. According to LBT, such premises are subject to inductive assessment fallacies, such as oversimplifying reality, distorting probabilities, and blind conjecture. However, While LBT helps clients improve their skills at making reasonable inductive inferences, it also emphasizes that this will not help them avoid problematic emotional consequences, for example, depression or anxiety, in situations where the client is not making any questionable factual claims. For example, several years down the road, it may become evident that I will not succeed in getting a job in academia. In such a case, if I am still prone to damning myself if I do not achieve my goals, then I will be setting myself up for experiencing depression or other negative self-destructive emotions. So it's really the evaluative fallacies, these evaluative speech acts, these negative ones that cause a lot of trouble. And even if you get rid of some of your reportative speech acts, that's not good enough because, even if they're true, they're not true now. Those reportative speech acts, they may be true sometime down the road, in which case, the evaluative speech acts are going to kick in and LBT, hence LBT stresses the importance of overcoming behavioral and emotional fallacies. Both LBT and REBT have this emphasis in common. In contrast, other CBT approaches tend to stress inductive fallacies, such as overgeneralization. And that would be, the Beckian schools that, arose at the beginning of the history of CBT. And I have a table that summarizes some major fallacious, self-destructive behavioral and emotional speech acts that people perform in speaking to themselves without paying much attention to what they're doing. And these acts may receive little inspection with no attempt to critically assess their rationality. And often people speak to themselves in these ways, and as a result, drive themselves needlessly into self-destructive cognitive behavioral states, such as anxiety, depression, guilt, and anger. So let me share the screen here. Let me take that opportunity to do that here, and I'll show you my diagram, my table. Let me bring it down. Can you see it? Okay. So you see demanding perfection, that's a fallacious speech act. And it's a type of reasoning error that occurs in the emotional reasoning. It's when you have emotions like anxiety and depression, you're likely to be doing emotional reasoning. And the description of the speech act is dictating the terms of reality by constructing idealistic generalizations and demanding that they be true. Example is, I must always be in control. I should never do anything wrong. Catastrophizing is emotional reasoning, again, exaggerating the badness of something or of its consequences. If I don't get a teaching job after all these years of graduate study, then I might as well be dead. Okay, here you're catastrophizing. You're not just reporting, you're catastrophizing, damning, devaluating self, life, others, or the world according to an aspect or part of it. If I don't get a teaching job, if I fail the exam, then I'll be such a loser. Decreeing reality, emotional reasoning, establishing by fiat what is true or acceptable according to one's own subjectivity. And this is examples of that would be, it's true because I said so, or I love escargot, so that's what's on the menu. Jumping on the bandwagon, committing oneself to a cause, action, group, etc. And capacity, disavowing, denying one's capacity to think, feel, act, or exercise willpower in a certain way, threatening, committing to harm or harming the listener in some way if they don't comply with a certain demand. You better watch your step. So you can see here, the fallacies are really speech acts, that are being performed. Okay. And they can, lead to needlessly self-destructive cognitive behavioral states, as I said, such as anxiety, depression, guilt, and anger. There's a part that's neuropsychological background of self-destructive speech acts, where I talk about, how the speech acts connect with the various portions of the brain and so forth. But we already had some discourse on that kind of thing, so I will skip that here and go on to the next section, which is called Philosophical Antidotes. And this section brings up another major insight, and that's an insight gleaned from contemporary neuropsychology. And that's that the way the brain processes abstract language in comparison to concrete terms. Abstract thinking, defined as thinking in general, less descriptive terms, versus concrete thinking in more detailed empirical or event-oriented terms, tend to be more aligned with a positive valence and affect, and to be associated with greater happiness. Based on these findings, and there's a number of different references that I've given here, based on these findings, because philosophical theories tend to use abstract language, thinking in the latter terms rather than focusing primarily on concrete events and situations can be hypothesized to promote positive valence and affect. This would appear to include abstract language used to construct philosophical theories or ideas. For example, growth, potentiality, meaning, transcendence, reality, wisdom, truth, power, peace, love, freedom, and responsibility, to cite just a few examples. My philosophical counseling experience has consistently confirmed the latter hypothesis. Clients who resonate with a philosophical idea during imagery exercises, first imagining something that upsets them and then shifting their focus to the philosophical idea, have invariably reported feeling a sense of relief from the torment that they've experienced. Combined with other abstract language, such as literary metaphors, philosophical language can, in my experience, be particularly uplifting and can have antidotal properties against negative self-destructive thoughts and emotions. Feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is my anchor, as conveyed by Thich Nhat Hanh, can help counteract the internal self-talk of someone catastrophizing about their situation. This concise and pithy counteractive affirms a Buddhist philosophy of courage, according to which one has the power to let go of self-destructive fear by mindfully focusing on one's breathing. I say this act of philosophical affirmation can help a person to let go of their fear. However, it may not work for everyone. Another person may be less disposed toward mindful antidotes and react more favorably to existential speech acts, such as life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose, as conveyed by Viktor Frankl. Philosophical counteractives to self-defeating speech acts, such as catastrophizing, damnation, demanding perfection, and capacity disavowing, are intimately bound up with one special type of philosophical language, that of virtue. Thus, performance of the above Buddhist counteractive by someone who has been catastrophizing about their future can help build courage in the face of fear. Similarly, performance of the above existential counteractive by someone who finds purpose in overcoming a challenging situation can support emotional self-control in the face of this challenge. A tool, and here the next section here is a toolbox of philosophical antidotes. Okay. The Logic-Based Therapy and Consultation Institute, US, has developed a philosophical antidote toolbox with the assistance of ChatGPT, consisting of thousands of different philosophical antidotes. It's interesting, we talked about AI here, but we talked mostly about some of the negative aspects of it, but let's see what you think. The latter AI program was first given several books and articles to read about LBT. One of them is this new book here. It read the whole thing, and this is by myself and a number of colleagues, Sam Zinich, Himani Chakar, Florin Labont. So it read this book and some others and some articles. The latter AI program was thus well fed, with LBT. So it became sort of an expert, on the modality. It was then given detailed instructions for generating the antidotes, including the fallacious speech acts to be counteracted. For example, the above Buddhist antidote was created to counteract catastrophizing, and the above existential antidote to counteract disavowing capacity to tolerate unwanted circumstances. Each antidote in the toolbox is subsumed under a matching virtue. For example, the existential speech act is categorized under self-control, and the Buddhist speech act under courage. Presently, the system includes antidotes to cultivating the virtues of self-control, courage, authenticity, empathy, metaphysical security, and respect for self, others, and the world. Each of these virtues is in turn matched with a fallacious speech act, so that a philosophy that is intended to build a particular virtue is also intended to overcome its matching fallacious speech act. And there's another table here that shows the matching virtues for each of the fallacies, and I could show you that here. So you can see that the guiding virtue of demanding perfection is metaphysical security, and the virtue performative is embracing imperfection. So to have metaphysical security, to be secure about reality and its imperfection, one tells oneself things, one performs certain types of self-talk that's part of having that virtue, the way a virtuous person speaks to themselves, if they're metaphysically secure. One might be without imperfection, there would be nothing to aim at, and life would be boring. That's to embrace imperfection. When you're saying that to yourself, you're not just describing something, you are embracing imperfection. And that's the type of talk, that somebody who's secure about imperfections in reality is going to exhibit. So this description of the virtue would be accepting emotionally as well as intellectually the imperfections in reality, including the various types of imperfections that are listed there. It's uncertainty, human fallibility, and so forth. Catastrophizing, similarly, the virtue, guiding virtue is courage, and it involves accepting uncertainty here. We talked a bit about uncertainty, and here, if you're really courageous, you're going to accept uncertainty. In living, there's no certainties, only probabilities. And saying that, you're accepting uncertainty. You're subscribing to uncertainty. You're saying this is the way it is, and I accept it. Damnation, damning, respect. And there's different types of respect: self, world, others, life. Accepting the intrinsic worth of self, others, the world, life. I'm a child of God, is a theological way of accepting your intrinsic worth. And we're going to talk more about this kind of thing because you might not be theological, so that might not work for you as a virtue performative. Jumping on the bandwagon, authenticity is the guiding virtue. This is committing oneself to being autonomous. I am a rational, self-determining being. When you say that to yourself, you're committing yourself to being autonomous. Capacity disavowing. This is the constipation that was referred to a number of times today at the conference. Self-control is the guiding virtue, and there's multiple types of self-control: emotional self-control, cognitive self-control, volitional self-control, behavioral self-control, acknowledging power over one's own emotions, actions, volitions, or thoughts. For instance, if one said, if we could not have power over what we do, think, or feel, we would be robots devoid, you see, of what makes us human. Here, what you're doing is acknowledging your power, over your emotions and your other capacities. Threatening here, the virtue of that speech act is empowerment, and the corresponding virtue performative is recognizing the self-determination of others. We all have a right to our beliefs, okay? Decreeing reality, something to the extreme, you have narcissistic personality disorder, and the guiding virtue there is empathy. Very important. And we talked about that earlier when we were talking about feminist approaches combined with logic-based therapy. As you see, that's a virtue built right into LBT. Affirming the subjectivity of others. We make worlds. We just don't discover them. Okay, Nelson Goodman's thing there as a philosophy. And there, when you say something like that, you are affirming the subjectivity of others, not just, your own. Others do that too. Okay, so with that in mind, in the virtue performative column of the table that you just saw are major uplifting speech acts performed by antidotes to the corresponding fallacious speech acts. The examples column in turn provides illustrations. Such philosophical antidotes perform speech acts that help build matching virtues. This is because virtues have a cognitive dimension linked to the way in which virtuous people speak to themselves. For example, in speaking Sartre's philosophy of personal autonomy to oneself, that man is condemned to be free, one commits oneself to being autonomous. In this manner, it can serve as an uplifting antidote to jumping on the bandwagon. Through the utterance as a perlocutionary effect of it, this pithy affirmative speech act can help an existential client to feel a sense of responsibility to shape their own destiny instead of relying on the directives of others or on social standards that may be quashing the individual's sense of ownership over their own life. An example of the latter would be the trad wife who secretly dreams of becoming an independent, self-actualized person instead of a handmaiden to her husband. Okay. Of course, Sartre's philosophy may be repugnant to the trad wife, who can more appropriately resonate with a Christian antidote that might promote her autonomy from a Christian perspective. Indeed, because each virtue can be approached from several different philosophical perspectives, the philosophical antidotes in the toolbox have been generated from 7 major philosophical perspectives: existential, stoic, humanistic, theistic, mindfulness-based, pragmatic, and ethical. For example, some philosophical antidotes have been created to promote self-control from a theistic perspective and some from a humanistic perspective. In this way, people with different philosophical worldviews can find antidotes that help build virtues from their individual perspectives and comfort levels. And I'm going to actually use for this portion of our talk, my talk, to use the online toolbox, so you get a sense of what we're talking about here. Okay. Let me, oops, that's the wrong one there. Okay, so find antidotes to your self-defeating thinking. And it starts here, and you press the start button. And here we go. Guiding virtues, cardinal fallacies, and their philosophical antidotes. And you can see here, and I won't read this, but you can see the categories here of the different types of antidotes. There's the existential antidotes. These emphasize finding your own meanings, personal responsibility, and freedom to choose despite the inherent uncertainty and risks in life. So some people might meet that description. Some clients that you work with as philosophical practitioners or as psychotherapists might be existential, in their approach. And, one of the questions that I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, by people I'm training is, well, how do you approach helping the client to find, antidotes that resonate with them, that help build their virtues. And, this is a way to help in that process, because you can find out, what kind of perspective you take. Are you looking for, personal meanings in life, to are you place emphasis on personal responsibility, freedom to choose? Is that you? Or are you focused on accepting that there are things that you cannot control? For example, other people, attitudes and reactions, and maintaining inner peace through reason and discipline. Are you that type of thinker? Everybody's got their particular philosophical predilections here. Are you pragmatic? I worked with a Russian client who she was raised in a culture that was rather pragmatic, and she saw everything in terms of pragmatics. And the way I was able to work with her was to use pragmatic antidotes. John Dewey and William James, and these guys were, and Richard Rorty were, useful kinds of approaches for this particular individual client. These offer practical solutions through effective action-oriented strategies. Ethical antidotes. These focus on the moral significance of how you respond to life situations. Mindfulness-based antidotes. These encourage being present in the here and now, observing your negative thoughts and feelings instead of judging them, letting them go rather than clinging to them. Theistic. These draw strengths from faith in a higher power or divine providence, often tied to religious traditions, including both Eastern and Western ones. Humanistic antidotes. These stress human dignity, self-empowerment, empathy, and personal growth in the face of life changes. So you can kind of get the sense of where your client is coming from before you start working with them and seeing what kind of antidotes might resonate with them. But that's not the end of it. There are also broader resonance categories, appeals classifications as well. Humanistic and existential appeal can cut, across other types of philosophical approaches, the 7 approaches we mentioned. Focuses on personal growth, self-expression, and meaning-making. Practical and problem-solving appeals to those who value actionable and result-oriented thinking. Rational and logical appeal attracts individuals who prioritize intellectual clarity and reasoned decision-making. Spiritual and transcendental appeal resonates with faith-based or spiritually motivated individuals. Heroic and aspirational appeal inspires admiration for courage, resilience, and noble action. Mindfulness and introspection appeals to those who value self-awareness, internal peace, and mindfulness practices. Resilience and growth highlights the transformative power of perseverance through adversity. Integrity and moral appeal emphasizes ethical consistency and living in alignment with one's own values. Relational and empathy appeal promotes connection, compassion, and shared humanity. Harmony and simplicity encourages balance, letting go and valuing the essentials in life. Discipline and mastery appeal advocates for self-regulation, control over impulses, and mastery of emotions. You see, so you have this taxonomy here that can allow you, to help the client to key into the types of antidotes that are likely, you see, to resonate with them. Hence, the Toolbox of Philosophical Antidotes provides numerous ways to appeal to categories of people coming from 7 alternative philosophical perspectives. This can enable them to select antidotes likely to resonate with them the most based on their personal philosophical profiles, general philosophical outlooks, and appeals. In addition, for each antidote it generates, the program provides an analysis and the language sensitivity element that suggests alternative language to use in lieu of self-defeating language. Finally, it makes suggestions for making constructive behavioral changes toward building the virtues in question. For example, I'm going to give an example derived from Carol Gilligan, which was included as an antidote to the world revolves around me RAM thinking, thus aimed at building empathy. Okay, and so let me actually show you what this looks like in real time here. This is so the antidote, as we saw, to that kind of thinking, this self-egocentric type of thinking is empathy. Okay, so we would look at empathy here, and if this individual whom we're working with, your client or just person seeking help, self-help, wants a mindfulness-based approach to antidotes, they have it, you see. And they can search these. Showing you around here. And here's one by Carol Gilligan. The antidote is the self is strengthened, not by domination, but by connection. How does that resonate with your client? It has an appeal, relational and empathy appeal. It encourages building relationships rooted in mutual understanding rather than control. The analysis is personal and collective growth arises from connections rather than hierarchical power dynamics. Language sensitivity, and this is your virtue performative essentially. Replace I need to control this situation to feel secure with I strengthen myself and others through connection, not control. And an actionable component, engage in dialogue today, and a dialogue today where your goal is to connect, not to persuade. See, and so what you have here is a mini analysis here that gets to the kind of core of how to make constructive changes if you happen to be a self-absorbed individual that finds themselves chasing people away and having really unsuccessful relationships, maybe interpersonal, on the job, intimate, and the like. And so how does this work? Well, people often believe that control or domination enhances their well-being and happiness. But the idea here is that selfless connection, paradoxically, builds security about oneself. Hence, a client who is inclined to see things from their own subjective perspective might work towards focusing their attention on the subjectivity of others in order to connect with it. So the AI program insightfully suggests a shift in language from that of control, I must be right, to that of connection. The actionable component then appropriately suggests engaging in a dialogue to connect rather than to control through the use of persuasion. Indeed, a characteristic of RAM thinking, that's the world revolves around me thinking, or RAM thinkers, is the use of well poisoning and other forms of intimidation to control what the other person thinks or feels. This antidote, therefore, can be quite useful in helping the client work toward changing such a modus operandi into one of connecting. The appeal category of relationship building is then appropriate for many RAM thinkers who find their interpersonal relationships suffering and are looking for guidance about how to identify and address the problem. Indeed, within the relatively brief anecdotal entry lies the basis for client constructive change. Philosophical counselors or psychotherapists working with such a client can accordingly utilize the toolbox as part of their therapeutic intervention. It is important to stress that for the antidote to be efficacious, it needs to resonate with the client. This means that the client needs to feel comfortable with the antidote. This is no time to be pushing your pet philosophy. As such, it can be useful when utilizing the toolbox to encourage the client to browse through the antidotes on their own and select those antidotes that seem to resonate with the client the most. Picking the antidotes for the client can have counterproductive consequences, as the client may come to believe that they are expected to think a certain way rather than feeling inclined to do so on their own. That said, the therapist can assist the client prior to conducting the search by suggesting the categories to which to search. Is the client theistic or more humanistically inclined? Does the client take an Eastern religious perspective? If so, the client might resonate well with a mindfulness-based antidote as well as a theistic one coming from an Eastern perspective. The system is culturally sensitive, and an attempt to build it was made to include various cultural perspectives. For example, there are theistic antidotes from Christian, Judaic, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist perspectives. This project appears to be the first of its kind to use artificial intelligence to create a systematic, comprehensive, online, free resource for helping people throughout the world find uplifting ideas that resonate with them. The purpose of this toolbox is to help overcome certain core types of irrational speech acts associated with self-defeating emotions and behaviors such as catastrophizing, damnation of self, others, and the world, constipation of various types, cognitive, volitional, behavioral, emotional, and demanding perfection of various kinds. In turn, it seeks to build the corresponding virtues to such self-destructive speech acts. The platform is intended to continue to evolve and to increase the scope of virtues it helps to build. And in conclusion, the performance of negative speech acts embedded in behavioral and emotional reasoning can create behavioral and emotional disturbances for the agent, such as anxiety, depression, guilt, and anger. Keying into these self-destructive and self-defeating speech acts is essential to overcoming them. This is because such linguistic activity on a neurological level activates stress centers in the brain, the limbic system, and related areas, which is phenomenologically experienced as emotional stress of various kinds, anxiety, depression, etc. Performing resonant, abstract, philosophical, antidotal speech acts to these irrational modes of speaking, and then acting in line with them, can help one work toward replacing the unhealthy ways of self-relating with healthy ones. The latter ways of self-relating are virtuous ways, such as self-control, courage, authenticity, empathy, metaphysical security, and respect for self, others, in the world. Such linguistic activity involves performance of speech acts such as committing oneself to being autonomous, accepting one's self-worth, embracing imperfection, and accepting uncertainty, which builds and sustains the affective and behavioral aspects of its related virtues. Accordingly, introduced here is a toolbox of different philosophical locutions that can serve as virtue performatives for diverse philosophical and cultural orientations and predilections. Philosophical practitioners and philosophically oriented psychotherapists may find this resource useful for various client populations with whom they work. It may also be useful to individuals who seek self-help in the form of philosophical counseling. Okay, that's the presentation.
Thank you, Elliot. That's really, really interesting stuff.
Thank you, Sam.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions.
I brought this up earlier, and so I'm wondering how you respond to that, because you mentioned autonomy and that you can change the way you think about things. But I mentioned before about where do these feelings come from? Where do they originate? And do they all originate in the person, or is it really their relationship to the world they live in, the culture they live in, family they live in? So I think that, the example that I brought up of school kids or middle school kids who take their own lives because they've been bullied, and are essentially told, you don't belong here. And they have integrated that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this feeling that they've integrated originates in them. So I think there's a difference between where does it originate and to what extent is it now overtaking them and pushing them to places of suicide or something. So there is a way that the world around you has an effect on you, right? It doesn't all just come out of nowhere and originates in you, and that's the end of it.
No, that would be a terrible straw man to say that. No, one has to look at the client in their environment.
Right.
The person in the environment is a very important part of social work practice, for instance. And
Right.
so we do as social workers, for instance, we look at the client, their culture, where they're embedded, their resources. Some of them are negative, but some of them are also positive. And you
Right.
really can't work with a client, independently of that context, because it's just going to come back to haunt them, And so, no, it's not, where it comes from is complex, and family systems approaches are very important, integrations of logic-based therapy with individuals, with individual counseling. And so, but that being said, I mean, when a person has, this feeling of self-doubt, that they see themselves as unworthy because they've been bullied and they've been brought up in that environment, uh, they need help, and that help can be drawn from, from the positive relationships they have and the connections that they make. And one of the central features of logic-based therapy, and I have a paper coming, just came out actually, on connectivity of logic-based therapy, which essentially connects the idea as logic-based therapy works on the interpersonal relationships and helps to
Okay.
connect clients with others in the world. And, doing the studies that have been done on trauma, for instance, have shown that the single most efficacious thing that you could do for a trauma patient is to build up their connections, because that's what's been severed. That's what's been severed through their environment. And so it's very important to help those clients gain connectivity, and that's where, the various virtues, they come together systematically to build connectivity, interconnectivity with their environment, with interpersonally, systematically, so that they're not alone. They feel like a part of something. And so your point is essential. I mean, to understanding, the nature of healing. You don't heal, and by yourself outside of that context. And you don't get sick typically without that context, And so we need to look at it. But the resources are very important, how you connect. Because
But also to turn it around. Let's say I had an example. This was a long time ago when I was teaching at, I think it was a middle school in the Netherlands or something. And I did an exercise with the kids, and one little girl came up with an excellent example of what I had been asking. And her response was, and I forget, my question. She says, "Oh, but that's when you're totally in love." And everybody started laughing, and she started crying. So I kind of left it there, and then I checked with her at the end of class. But the next day, I said to the class, "What? That was such a perfect example. Why did all of you start laughing?" So I started holding them to account why they made fun of her, essentially.
Mm.
And then they said, "Oh, well, we felt so embarrassed." And so that is maybe a situation where you can turn it around. And instead of going with the status quo, that's the way kids are, and they're cruel, and they do things like that. It's holding the kids that made fun of her to account. And I said, "Listen, that was an excellent example. That didn't deserve to be laughed at." So it's a way of bringing even though I can talk to her separately and say, this is what's going on, and maybe you can feel better. But I also have to bring the context back in, right? Do you
Yeah,
know what I
and
mean?
much of it is about validating feelings too. This little girl had her feelings hurt, and understanding your understanding of it, the class's understanding, that she had hurt feelings and how they might have felt too in that situation is what creates, those powerful interconnections. You started the conversation by asking the class, not judging the class immediately, but asking them, why were they laughing? And they said, well, they felt embarrassed. So this is sharing of feelings. So one can deflate, these hard feelings by expressing feelings. And a lot of times, and this is classic family counseling. Families bicker with each other because what they do is they talk about the content. They don't talk about the feelings. They don't go for the process. The process is typically more important. How the people are feeling, in response to other individuals. You got to watch their speech and what they're saying and the emotions that it's generating. And that sharing, is ultimately what's useful. And I found this time and time again. I mean, I've worked with a parent, a mother and daughter, for instance. I'm currently working with some of those, and they have these problematic relationships. And what helps them? Well, what helps them is to start seeing, the other not as somebody to sit there and criticize and blame, but rather to express their feelings and tell them, how they feel. And so, we talked about games and everything. I've done some role playing in those contexts where, okay, you're your daughter now. How are you feeling? And I'm playing the mother's role, and I'm speaking like the mother to the daughter, and the daughter, and to the mother, the real mother, but she's the
Right,
daughter.
right.
And the daughter mother is upset. So oh, you feeling this, but once that feeling was recognized and validated, then she understood what her daughter felt like. And it opens up, the door, to this interconnectivity and, seeing and empathizing and so forth. And the kind of thing, that we were talking about when we were talking about compassion, and combining LBT with compassion, which is natural for it because that's essentially what's built into it,
Right, right.
So, yeah, I mean, the things that you're raising are, like, part of the context of logic-based therapy, and it took a while to get there. I mean, developing this approach took years, and actually going to school to learn about
Right,
social
right.
work.
Yeah, no,
And
that's very important. And I think we've said that from the beginning in philosophical counseling, that just having a PhD in philosophy is not going to cut it. And
yeah,
so you have to be able to have some kind of background in counseling or in psychotherapy or whatever it is, so that you know how to work with people.
yeah,
And so that's a very important component. But the thing that I just wanted to say in addition is that the notion of accountability, that where this girl, it's not just that her feelings were hurt, but that she gave an excellent example that was dismissed. So apart from feelings, it was also, something that was worthy of an A+ response and was dismissed by the classroom.
yeah. I'm wondering if others have a sense of how they might utilize the toolbox with their clients. This is something, what I'd like to see here is buy-in by other philosophical practitioners. That is to say, what sort of antidotes have worked, with your clients, and how might you contribute,
Mm.
what you've learned to develop further entries, here so that we have a communal forum. It's ours. It's almost like Wikipedia of the
Yeah. No, that's
antidote
good.
world.
That's good. I
And
appreciate that. Yeah.
this is the beginning of something I think that we'll all take ownership in, So what
Because
do
the
you,
other example is by Nienke Dondius in Holland, who at the time, this is a long time ago, was working with the Jews that came out of the concentration camps. And her approach was to move people from victim to witness. And the point there was because when they came back, nobody wanted to talk about what had happened. And so they were silenced. And she actually opened the door to talking about it by not having them talk about their own personal experience that nobody wanted to hear, but be witness to what happened there. So again, it's an accountability. And I think those aspects are really of real importance, that we don't just operate from a personal point of view, but also holding society accountable.
right? I know we're 5 minutes
Over
out of
time, yeah.
time. I just, if there's anybody who wants to weigh in on this, I'd be beholden. Anybody have?
Elliot, I've been thinking, especially the past several months, that I want to revamp my intake forms. I want to revamp all my forms, but I think that having, and I had been thinking like about different categories. So I think the toolbox of antidote categories is a great way to do that, because most of my clients are very open to the mindfulness, but then some clients, they draw their line at certain things, and because there's it's very holistic. So and I know everyone's diverse, of course, but just having from the get-go what they're open to, the methods that they're open to, would be really helpful.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you for sharing that.
And that is available on I saw the website on your screen, so it's just
philosophicalpractice.net.
And it's all open source, open.
And there's
Oh, great.
And there's it says Philosophical Antidotes on the menu, and you just click on it and you're there.
Excellent. I will incorporate that. So thank you.
Very good. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
The moon is out.
Thank you.
It's time to go. It's through your window.